Vivian Crawford stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. The city glittered below her like a million scattered jewels, each light a reminder of the power and success she had built with her own hands. At 35, Vivian had everything anyone could dream of: money, a thriving fashion empire, and the kind of fame that only wealth could buy. Yet as she gazed at the city's pulse, the thumping heart of her empire, she felt none of the satisfaction she expected. Her fingers absently traced the rim of her crystal wine glass, the red liquid swirling lazily within. It was just another evening alone, no different from the others that had accumulated into months, then years. The parties, the galas, the meetings, they all blended together, each encounter another fleeting moment, devoid of depth or meaning. The glass reflected back the face of a woman who had everything but still couldn't seem to shake the ache in her chest. Behind her, the soft murmur of the television went unnoticed as the latest fashion show highlights played on a muted loop. A photo of her latest collection flashed across the screen. Vivian smiled faintly, proud of the designs but indifferent to the applause. It was easy, she thought, to create beauty when the world was at your feet, when your name was enough to make the world take notice. Yet, what good was all of it if the only people around you were those who cared about what you could give them? Her phone buzzed on the polished marble countertop. A text from Lillian, her closest friend and business partner. "Dinner at Jean-Luc's tonight?" Vivienne hesitated before typing a reply. "I'll pass. Long day." The truth was, she wasn't tired. She just didn't feel like pretending tonight, pretending that the fancy restaurant with its Michelin stars and velvet curtains could fill the emptiness inside her. She had tried for years to make these relationships work, to make people see her for more than the brand she'd built. But when it came to genuine connections, Vivienne felt like a ghost, drifting through the lives of others without ever truly engaging. The people she met at the high-profile events, the socialites and influencers, the business magnates, they all seemed like actors playing a role, caught up in a never-ending game of status and power. They laughed, they networked, they danced to the beat of a world she had long since stopped believing in. And no matter how many deals she closed, or how many trophies lined her shelves, Vivian never felt truly seen. There was always a part of her that remained hidden, locked away, afraid to step out from behind the walls she had built. Her gaze drifted to the bookshelf in the corner of the room, where a photo frame sat, half hidden behind a collection of leather-bound books. It was a picture of her mother, taken when she was young. Vivienne used to sit with her on the balcony of their family home, listening to her speak about love. Real love. The kind that transcended wealth and power. But those were just stories now, like fairy tales she had outgrown. After all, her mother had married the wrong man, someone who had never truly loved her, only the life she could provide. Vivian had promised herself that she wouldn't make the same mistake. She wouldn't let someone in unless they saw her for what she was. Vivian Crawford, the CEO, the woman with the power to shape industries. But now, standing in her luxurious apartment, with the city stretching out before her like a never-ending horizon, she realized that she hadn't truly let anyone see her in years. The only face anyone knew was the polished, perfect image she'd built up over time. A sudden knock at the door broke her reverie. "Miss Crawford," came the voice of Carla, her assistant. "Your dinner's ready." Vivian sighed, pushing away the thoughts that had begun to weigh heavily on her chest. Another evening alone, another round of room service and solitude. She stood and adjusted the hem of her silk robe, a piece from the latest collection, as she moved to the door. Her steps were quiet but purposeful, like the movements of someone who had learned long ago to keep herself composed, no matter what was happening beneath the surface. When she opened the door, Carla smiled warmly, holding a tray of food. Vivian gave her a polite nod, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Carla," she said, her voice lacking the warmth she'd intended. Carla set the tray down on the glass table before leaving without a word. The door clicked softly behind her, and Vivian was alone once more. As she sat down to eat, her mind wandered back to the conversation with Lillian. She hadn't replied to her friend's invitation, but it wasn't just dinner that Vivian was avoiding. It was the constant pressure to be something she wasn't. Someone with friends who truly cared. Someone who didn't have to shoulder the weight of a business empire alone. But that was the life she had chosen. That was the sacrifice she had made for success. Vivian pushed the plate away, unable to stomach the meal. The taste of her wine was the only thing that remained in her mouth. Bitter, empty. She reached for her phone again, this time opening the gallery. She scrolled through images of past events, meetings, and photo shoots. One particular photo caught her eye, a candid shot taken years ago before the empire, before the endless meetings and the wealth that had come with it. It was a picture of her, carefree and smiling, standing on a beach with friends. They were laughing, the kind of genuine joy that felt so distant now. Her younger self seemed like a stranger. She placed the phone face down and leaned back in her chair, her gaze shifting to the view outside. The city lights shimmered, reflecting her own discontentment in their glow. Vivienne had everything anyone could want, but in the quiet moments, when the world was still and she was left alone with her thoughts, she wondered if it was all worth it. And then, as if the universe had decided to intervene, a message popped up on her phone. "Will you be visiting the Brooklyn Artisan Market tomorrow? I have something I think you'll appreciate." It was from an unknown number, but the message piqued her curiosity. The message was signed only with a name: Daniel Ortega. The following day, Vivian stood before the floor-length mirror in her penthouse, adjusting her tailored blazer as she studied her reflection. A faint sigh escaped her lips, one that echoed in the quiet of the room. Today, she was headed to the Brooklyn Artisan Market, an unusual destination for someone like her. But curiosity had gnawed at her since receiving the cryptic message from Daniel Ortega. She had decided to make a quick visit before her next meeting, thinking it would be a distraction, nothing more. She hadn't replied to his text, and yet something about the simple, unassuming invitation intrigued her. Perhaps it was the stark contrast to the polished world she inhabited, where every interaction came with an expectation. Maybe it was the way his words felt, authentic. There were no pretensions, no grand gestures. Just a quiet promise of something different. She grabbed her oversized sunglasses from the glass countertop and slid them over her eyes, half hoping that they would shield her from whatever vulnerability might surface during this brief, unexpected detour. She needed to see what he was selling, to understand why he had reached out to her. But it was more than that. She needed something, though she couldn't yet put her finger on what. The drive to Brooklyn was quick, the streets blurring by in a mosaic of city life. As the sleek black car turned onto the bustling streets near the market, Vivian felt the first real stirrings of unease. This wasn't her world. There were no marble columns, no polished floors, no perfect lighting designed to make everything look as it should. Instead, there was the hum of conversation, the scent of fresh bread and earthy spices, and the raw beauty of handmade crafts. It was the kind of authenticity Vivian had been craving, but never known how to find. She stepped out of the car and adjusted the collar of her blazer, her heels clicking sharply against the uneven pavement as she walked through the market. Stalls lined the street, each one offering something different: woven scarves, colorful pottery, baskets of fragrant herbs. And then she saw him. Daniel Ortega stood behind a small wooden booth, surrounded by his creations. The hats, tattered yet meticulously crafted, caught Vivian's eye first. Each one seemed to tell a story, worn but loved, rough around the edges but undeniably unique. Her gaze fell to Daniel. He was tall, his dark hair slightly tousled, his skin sun-kissed, as though he'd spent much of his life working outdoors. His eyes were focused on his work, but there was a quiet intensity in his posture that made her pause. His hands, large and calloused, moved with an almost reverent precision as he carefully adjusted a hat on the display. She didn't know why, but seeing him here, in this setting, sparked something inside her. Something that made her forget for a moment the business empire she had built and the life she had created. She was an outsider here, an intruder on this world of simplicity and craftsmanship. And yet, as she approached his stall, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been summoned, that some force had pulled her to this moment. "Can I help you with something?" Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts, warm yet guarded. His gaze met hers, and for a brief moment, she saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, something that suggested he knew exactly who she was, despite the fact that they had only exchanged a few brief words the day before. I was just looking at your hats," Vivian said, her tone softer than she had intended. She glanced at the one closest to her, a faded patchwork hat with uneven stitching. It was beautiful in its imperfection, yet her eyes couldn't help but linger on its flaws. "You don't seem like the type to wear something like this," Daniel remarked casually, though there was an edge to his words. He wasn't mocking her, but his tone was more curious than complimentary. Vivian frowned, the comment catching her off guard. "I don't seem like the type?" She had never let anyone judge her so openly before, especially someone like him. "I suppose I'm not," she said, fighting the sting of defensiveness that crept up her throat. "But I appreciate craftsmanship. It's rare these days." Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Appreciating it is one thing. Understanding it is another." His eyes softened as he looked down at the hat he had been adjusting, his fingers gently running over the seams. "This one, for example, isn't just craftsmanship. It's a memory." Vivian tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. A memory? She hadn't expected him to share anything personal, certainly not so quickly. Yet, there was something in his voice that made her want to hear more. She crossed her arms, leaning in slightly. "It's a hat my wife made," he said quietly, his gaze momentarily distant. "She spent weeks on it, stitching the pieces together. Each patch represents something she held dear, a moment, a place, a person. She sewed it during a time when we had nothing but each other." Vivian's breath caught, the words hitting her harder than she expected. Her mind raced, trying to understand the depth behind his casual tone. A wife? This man was married? She hadn't expected that. And there was something in his expression now, something so raw and personal, that it made her feel like she had stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to see. "I didn't mean to," she started, but her words faltered as she glanced at the hat again. The gentle, almost reverent way Daniel touched it was enough to make her feel like an intruder. "It's all right," Daniel said, shaking his head. "I don't mind. Most people don't ask. They just see a shabby hat and move on. But for me, it's a part of her, a part of me." Vivian swallowed, a lump forming in her throat. There was something painfully beautiful in the way he spoke. So matter-of-fact, and yet so deeply vulnerable. It made her wonder how much he had suffered, how much he had lost, how much she might have missed in her own life by hiding behind the walls she'd built. "I'm sorry," she said again, this time more softly, more sincerely. "I didn't realize." Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Most people don't, but that's all right. They don't have to." For a moment there was a silence between them, filled only by the ambient sounds of the market. Vivian stood there, struggling to grasp what had just transpired. She had come here to look at hats. Something superficial, something she could easily critique. Instead, she had uncovered a piece of someone's heart, and it had disarmed her in a way she hadn't anticipated. I'll take this one, she said, surprising both of them. Daniel blinked, his gaze narrowing slightly as he searched her face for a sign of insincerity. But when he saw none, he nodded and carefully wrapped the hat in brown paper, his hands moving with practiced ease. Vivienne reached into her bag for her credit card, but before she could pull it out, Daniel stopped her. "No need," he said. "This one's on me. Consider it a gift, a reminder that things aren't always what they seem." Her chest tightened as she took the hat from him, the weight of his words settling over her. For the first time in a long while, Vivienne felt something stir deep inside her, something raw, real, and undeniably human. As she turned to leave, she glanced back at Daniel. He was already back to his work, his attention fixed on the next hat, but his words lingered in her mind. Things aren't always what they seem. Maybe this market, maybe this man, was exactly what she needed. Vivienne didn't expect to return to the Brooklyn artisan market so soon, but the weight of Daniel's gift, the hat, stayed with her. It wasn't just the hat itself, though it had a quiet, understated beauty to it. No, it was the story behind it, the way Daniel had spoken about his late wife, Sophie, and the raw emotion he had shown despite the walls he'd obviously built around himself. She found herself thinking about it all day, about the woman he had loved, about how he had kept her memory alive in something as simple as a hat. Back in her apartment that evening, Vivienne stared at the hat now sitting on her coffee table. It was more than an object. It felt like a symbol of something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. How could something so humble carry so much meaning? Her fingers hovered over the brim, but she pulled her hand back, unsure. She wasn't sure what she was hoping to feel when she touched it. Sympathy? Regret? Something else entirely? She glanced around her pristine apartment, the walls lined with art pieces she'd chosen because they fit the aesthetic of success, the minimalistic furniture, the soft lighting, the perfect balance between chic and comfortable. Everything was designed to reflect a version of her life she had meticulously curated, a life that appeared flawless from the outside but felt hollow when she was alone. The thought of Daniel's booth, cluttered with the honesty of hand-woven scarves and clay mugs, made her uneasy. His world, his real world, was so different from her own. She had spent years learning how to curate an image, but Daniel seemed to just be. She picked up the phone and texted Lillian. "Do you have time to talk?" "Always. Come over." An hour later, Vivienne arrived at Lillian's sleek Upper East Side apartment. Lillian greeted her with a hug, and they settled into the kitchen with glasses of wine. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the evening light, and Vivienne immediately felt the warmth of familiarity, something she hadn't realized she missed. "What's going on?" Lillian asked, her eyes soft with concern as she poured them both wine. Vivienne stared into her glass, swirling the deep red liquid before speaking. "I went to Brooklyn today, to that artisan market." Lillian raised an eyebrow. "Brooklyn? What for? I thought you were booked for meetings all day?" Vivienne hesitated, the words coming more easily than she expected. "I met someone, a man who makes hats." Lillian chuckled. "A hat maker? What's this? Some kind of quirky love story?" Vivienne's lips quirked into a small smile, but it quickly faded. "It's not like that. I mean, I don't know what it is. You've got me intrigued." Lillian settled in, her eyes narrowing with that characteristic intensity Vivienne had always admired. "So, what's the deal? A hat maker caught your eye?" Vivienne sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "It's not just the hats, Lil. It's him. His whole world is so different from mine. He makes these hats by hand. And everyone tells a story. He even gave me one today. It's not like anything I've ever seen, it's personal. But what struck me the most was how he spoke about it. Lillian studied her, the casual banter slipping away as she became more serious. What did he say? He told me that the hat was made by his late wife, Sophie, that she sewed each patch with memories of their life together. It's so raw and real. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. It's just... Vivian cut herself off, shaking her head. It's just a hat, right? But it felt like so much more. Like he gave me a piece of his heart, wrapped up in something so simple. Lillian's eyes softened. And how does that make you feel? Vivian looked up at her friend, the words heavy on her tongue. It's uncomfortable. I've spent my whole life building this image, this empire. Everything is calculated, controlled. I've surrounded myself with people who need me for what I can give them, not for who I am. But with him, it feels different. It feels like he sees me. Not the brand, not the perfect version of me I put out there. He sees me, and that scares the hell out of me. Lillian's expression softened further, her gaze a mix of understanding and quiet concern. So, what's holding you back? Vivian hesitated. I don't know. I'm not used to being vulnerable, Lil. I've built my entire life around being untouchable, invulnerable. But with Daniel... She stopped, the words feeling too heavy to say. Lillian leaned forward. Are you afraid of what might happen if you let him in? Or are you afraid of what might happen if you don't? Vivian's heart raced at the question, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and clarity all at once. She had spent years focusing on her business, never allowing herself to truly connect with anyone, always keeping people at arm's length. Now, faced with someone who seemed to offer nothing but sincerity, she felt both drawn to him and terrified of what that might mean. Both, Vivian admitted softly. I think I'm afraid of letting him in because I don't know what it means for me, for my life. If I open up, what happens to all this? She gestured to the elegant space around her. Does it all fall apart? Does it make me weak? And if I don't, what do I lose? Someone who actually sees me. Lillian sat back in her chair, her eyes studying Vivian with a knowing intensity. You've spent so long building walls around yourself, Viv. And yeah, maybe you've kept people out, but it's also kept you from living, from really living, from feeling. And I think you know that. Vivian didn't answer at first. She stared into her wine glass, trying to make sense of everything, trying to reconcile the woman she had become with the woman she wanted to be. You deserve to feel, Viv. To feel love, to feel loss, to feel all of it. Not just the safe, easy parts of life, the messy ones too. Vivian looked up, her eyes meeting Lillian's. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Not for the power she wielded, not for the persona she had created, but for the woman beneath it all. The woman who was still searching for something real. Maybe I do, Vivian said quietly. Maybe I do. The next few days felt like an endless loop for Vivian, her thoughts consumed by the memory of Daniel. The market, the hats, the way he had talked about his late wife. It all lingered in her mind like a melody she couldn't shake. She found herself walking through her apartment more slowly, as if the weight of those moments was anchoring her to something she hadn't yet figured out. Despite the tension in the air, despite the unease that gnawed at her, she felt drawn to him, like a moth to a flame. The strange thing was that it wasn't just about the hat or even about the story he'd shared. It was more about how he made her feel, how, for the first time in years, she felt small in a way that didn't frighten her. She felt real, but the truth was, Vivian didn't know how to navigate this. She had spent her entire life building walls, ensuring no one could get too close, and now that someone had, well, she wasn't sure what to do with it. As if on cue, her phone buzzed on the marble countertop, jolting her from her thoughts. She picked it up quickly, almost as though she had been expecting it. It was a message from Daniel. "I've got another piece for you if you're still interested. It's a little different. Come by when you can." Vivian's heart fluttered in her chest. She had been toying with the idea of returning, but she hadn't expected him to reach out first. The simplicity of the message, the casual way he invited her back into his world, made her feel like he wasn't just trying to sell her something. He was offering her a chance to step deeper into his life. She took a deep breath, setting the phone down before grabbing her bag. She wasn't ready for what might come, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she had a choice. The drive to Brooklyn was quiet, the streets of Manhattan giving way to the grittier, more colorful feel of the borough. Vivian's mind raced as the city passed in a blur, her thoughts tangled between fear and longing. What was she doing? What was she expecting? She arrived at the artisan market just as the sun began to dip, casting long shadows over the stalls. It was quieter than before, the crowds thinner, but the energy was still there. The buzz of people who loved what they did, the hum of realness, of authenticity that was often lacking in the world she inhabited. She spotted Daniel's booth from a distance, and her breath caught in her chest. There he was, standing tall with his back to her, bending over a workbench, his hands deftly weaving through fabric. He didn't hear her approach, and for a moment she stood there watching him, unsure of how to break the silence. Finally he turned, a small guarded smile tugging at his lips when he saw her. "Back for more, huh?" Daniel's voice was warm, but there was a guardedness in his tone that made Vivian's chest tighten. She had a sense that he was watching her carefully, as though he were waiting to see what she would do next. "I didn't expect to hear from you," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. "I thought I might have overstayed my welcome last time." He shook his head, his eyes not meeting hers. "I don't mind. It's not like I get a lot of customers who actually want to see the pieces." He paused, looking at her more closely. "Most just come for a quick look and move on. You've been different." Vivian wasn't sure if it was a compliment or something else, but she felt the weight of it regardless. He had noticed her, seen her. "I wanted to come back," she said, her voice more steady now, as if the simple act of admitting it was a small step toward something more. Daniel stepped aside, motioning for her to look at what he was working on. There was a new hat on the table, this one different from the one she had bought. It was simple in design, but the stitching was intricate, and it had a quiet elegance that immediately caught her attention. "This one's for someone special," Daniel explained without looking at her, his fingers still working on the delicate weave. "It's not finished yet, but I thought you might appreciate the simplicity." Vivian leaned in closer to inspect the piece, her fingers brushing lightly against the soft fabric. It was almost as though the hat had been made to capture the quiet beauty of its creator, unassuming yet full of depth. It was the kind of piece she could never produce in her world of high-end, fast-paced fashion. "I do appreciate it," Vivian said softly, her voice carrying a hint of something deeper. "It's beautiful. But why give it to me?" Daniel stopped working, finally meeting her gaze. There was a fleeting moment of silence, the air thick with something unspoken. "I don't know," he said quietly. "Maybe because you're the first person who's actually asked me about them, really asked." Vivian felt the ground shift beneath her feet. He was opening up to her in a way that felt raw, real, and terrifying. She wanted to reach out, to say something, but she was afraid that if she did, it might break the fragile connection that had begun to form between them. "You know," she began, her voice slightly trembling, "I've spent my life curating an image. Everything I do is calculated. Every relationship, every deal, even the way I present myself. It's all part of the job." She paused, realizing how much she had revealed in those few words. She'd never been so open about it, not even to Lillian. "But when I see something like this," she gestured toward the hat, "it makes me wonder if I've been missing out on something." Daniel's expression softened. He was silent for a long moment, and Vivian wondered if he was about to say something that would change everything. But instead, he reached out, gently lifting the unfinished hat and placing it in front of her. "I think we all miss out on things," he said simply, "but you have to be willing to let go, to see things for what they are, not what you've built them up to be." Vivian stood there, her fingers lightly touching the fabric, her heart pounding in her chest. The words rang true, but they were also a challenge. He was asking her to let go of the control, the perfection she had so carefully crafted, and allow herself to truly feel. For the first time in years, she didn't know what would come next. The following week felt like an eternity to Vivian. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's booth, the way he'd looked at her when he gave her the unfinished hat, and the quiet words he had spoken. "You have to be willing to let go." The phrase haunted her. She couldn't stop thinking about it. Her life, her career, her world had always been about control. But in Daniel's presence, that control slipped away, like sand between her fingers. The thought of stepping into his world, a world so far removed from her own, unsettled her, and yet the idea of walking away from it entirely felt even more terrifying. It was Saturday morning when Vivian found herself back in Brooklyn, walking the familiar path toward the market. The sunlight glinted off the windows of the nearby buildings, but the air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of the city. Today, she wasn't just visiting his booth again out of curiosity. She was searching for something she couldn't quite name. As she neared Daniel's stall, she saw him standing behind the counter, his hands busy with a new piece of fabric. He looked up when she approached, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. "Back again?" he asked, his voice soft but guarded. The tone caught her off guard. She couldn't tell if he was pleased to see her or if he was simply resigned to her presence. "I wanted to see you," Vivian said before she could stop herself, the words slipping out with an honesty that surprised her. She immediately regretted it, but there was no taking it back. Daniel's gaze softened, just a little. "I see." He set the fabric down, wiping his hands on his apron before gesturing to the booth. "What can I do for you today?" Vivian looked at the assortment of hats, some unfinished, others ready to be sold. But her attention immediately went to the same patchwork hat he had shown her the other day, the one made by his late wife. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about it since their last meeting. The way he had spoken about Sophie with such tenderness, such raw emotion. It made Vivian feel both protective and unsure, as if she were an intruder in a grief too deep to be shared so freely. I wanted to know more," Vivian said, her voice quieter now. "About your wife. About the hats." Daniel's eyes darkened slightly, and for a moment, Vivian thought he might withdraw from her, retreat into the fortress he had built around his past. But instead, he exhaled slowly, a reluctant acceptance in his gaze. "I don't talk about her much," he said softly. "It's easier not to." Vivian nodded, understanding the weight of the unspoken words. "I think that's why I'm here. I'm trying to understand." There was a long silence between them, and Vivian wasn't sure if it was because she had pushed too hard, or if it was because they were both standing on the edge of something fragile, something neither of them was quite ready to face. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice rough, almost imperceptible. "Sophie." She made these hats when we had nothing. We were young, struggling to make ends meet. I couldn't give her the life she deserved, but she never complained. She found ways to create beauty in the simplest of things. This hat," he gestured to the patchwork one, "was her way of holding on to the small moments we shared. It was her reminder that even in hardship, there was love. It was everything to her." Vivian swallowed hard, trying to push back the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. She hadn't expected to hear him speak of his wife with such reverence, such depth. It felt as though he had just let her glimpse into the most sacred part of his heart, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for that kind of intimacy. "I'm sorry," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't mean to make you relive it." Daniel met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. "You didn't. It's just hard sometimes. Letting go of the past. Letting go of her." Vivian nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle deep within her. For all her success, all her wealth, she had never allowed herself to love like that. Never allowed herself to give someone else the kind of piece of herself that Daniel had given Sophie. She had spent her life protecting her heart, keeping it behind walls of ambition, control, and power. But in Daniel's eyes, she saw something different, something raw and real that made her ache for a life she had never allowed herself to have. "You don't have to let go of her," Vivian said softly. "Not completely. Not if you don't want to." Daniel's expression softened, the first hint of a smile breaking through his guarded demeanor. "I'm not sure if I know how to let anyone in again." Vivian felt her heart skip a beat at his words. "I don't know how to let anyone in either," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe we don't have to figure it out all at once." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the market, the distant chatter of vendors, the clinking of change, the rustle of fabric, seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in this fragile, unspoken understanding. The walls between them had begun to crumble, and though the vulnerability was terrifying, Vivian realized that she didn't want to turn away from it. "I've been thinking about you," she said before she could stop herself. The words felt foreign on her lips, yet they were true. "About the way you live, about how you've built something real with your own hands, in a world that's so often fake. It's inspiring." Daniel looked down at the hat he was working on, his fingers moving absently as he processed her words. "It's not always easy," he said quietly. "It's hard to keep going when the world keeps telling you to give up, to compromise, but you find a way to keep doing what you love." Vivian's breath caught. Compromise. That was what she had done her whole life. She had compromised her heart, her happiness, her relationships, all in the name of success. She had convinced herself that if she kept climbing, kept reaching for the next thing, the next achievement, everything would fall into place. But now, standing here in this small market stall, surrounded by something simple and real, she realized how much she had lost along the way. She looked at Daniel, her chest tight with emotion. "Maybe I need to stop compromising too." He met her gaze, his eyes searching hers, as though weighing the sincerity of her words. After a long pause, he spoke softly, almost as if to himself. "Maybe you do." The following days felt heavier to Vivian, each one pulling her further from the carefully constructed world she had built, and yet strangely, she felt more alive than she had in years. The brief moments she spent with Daniel, listening to him talk about his wife Sophie and watching him weave his craft, had begun to chip away at the walls she had carefully erected around her emotions. He was everything she was not, authentic, raw, and unafraid to love deeply, even in the face of loss. It was disorienting, yet it pulled at her heart in a way nothing else had. But the life she had spent years constructing wasn't going to let go so easily, and neither would her past. It was late afternoon when her phone buzzed again, and she almost didn't pick it up. It was an email from her assistant. "Vivian, we need to talk about the upcoming partnership with Ashton Designs. They're asking for final approval on the campaign visuals. There's a meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. Let me know if you need anything else before that." Vivian sighed, feeling a familiar tension tighten in her chest. Ashton Designs was one of the most prestigious luxury brands in the market. The campaign they were pushing was one of the biggest deals of her career, and it would cement her position at the top of the fashion world. There was no way she could afford to turn it down. But the thought of attending another sterile business meeting, dressed in her sharpest suit and talking numbers instead of feelings, filled her with a sudden, overwhelming emptiness. Her gaze shifted to the patchwork hat on the coffee table, its presence now a constant reminder of the life she was beginning to question. The soft fabric, worn with history, seemed to mock her as she sat there, caught between two worlds. On one side was the ever-demanding world of fashion, prestige, and power. On the other was Daniel, with his simple life, his memories of love, and his ability to create something beautiful out of the mundane. She thought of him, his gentle hands, the way he spoke about Sophie with such tender reverence. It was the kind of love she had never allowed herself to experience, at least not in the raw, unfiltered way he had with her. And now, after everything they had shared, she wasn't sure where she stood. The phone buzzed again, a message this time. "Are you coming by today? I'm finishing up a new piece. It's different than what you've seen before. Come by when you can." The message was from Daniel. Vivian's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the way he wrote to her. Simple, no expectations, just an invitation. But even that invitation made her feel as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice. She set the phone down and stared at the screen for a long time, her mind warring between the two choices, Daniel and the life she had always known. The life she had built on ambition and drive. The life she had worked so hard to construct, to perfect. She stood up suddenly, as though making up her mind, but instead she paced the room, running a hand through her hair. This wasn't something she could continue to ignore. She had to make a decision. There was no denying that she was deeply drawn to Daniel, his honesty, his quiet strength, the way he carried his grief without allowing it to define him. But what did it mean for her? Could she let go of everything she had worked so hard for? Could she walk away from the world of fashion, wealth, and status? The thought of it terrified her, but she didn't know how to continue living in a world that didn't make her feel. She picked up her phone again and typed a response to Daniel. "I'll be there in an hour." The drive to Brooklyn was faster than usual, though the distance felt endless. Vivian couldn't shake the feeling that every mile between her and the market was a mile further from her life. When she arrived at the booth, the market was quieter than before, the sun hanging low in the sky as shadows stretched across the street. She found Daniel sitting on a wooden crate, his hands holding a new piece of fabric, but his eyes were on her as she approached. "You came," he said, his voice softer than usual. He wasn't surprised, but there was something in his gaze that suggested he had been waiting for this moment, uncertain if she would show. "I did," Vivian said, her voice unsteady. She walked toward him, her heart beating faster with every step. She had made up her mind, and yet she wasn't sure how to say what needed to be said. Daniel stood up, brushing his hands on his worn jeans. "I'm almost done with this one," he said, motioning to the fabric in his hands. "It's different from the others, more intricate." Vivian nodded, but didn't speak immediately. She was drawn to the piece he was working on, its simplicity, but the intricate design woven into the fabric. It was beautiful, but in a way that felt almost impossible to create. It reminded her of the way she had always structured her life, everything organized, everything planned, but still, somehow, full of intricate layers that no one could see. "You've been quiet," Daniel remarked after a beat. "Is everything all right?" Vivian hesitated, the question lingering in the air. Was everything all right? Was she okay? She had spent so long living in a world where everything had a clear answer, a neat conclusion. But with Daniel, everything was different. The answers weren't so clear. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm not sure where I belong anymore. I've spent my whole life chasing things, building a life that looks perfect on the outside. But it's all just empty. I thought that if I had everything I needed, wealth, status, success, that it would fill the space inside of me. But it hasn't. It hasn't, Daniel." There was a pause, and she could see that Daniel was studying her, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke softly. "You don't have to let go of everything to find what you're looking for, Vivian. You just have to stop running from it." Vivian swallowed hard, his words hitting her in ways she couldn't have expected. She had been running from her own emotions, her own vulnerability for so long. But with Daniel, there was no place to hide. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared that if I let go of the life I've built, I'll lose everything." "You don't have to lose anything," Daniel said gently, stepping closer to her. "But sometimes you have to risk everything to find out what really matters." Vivian looked into his eyes, the raw honesty there making her feel as though he could see right through her. Maybe it was time to stop running. The days following her conversation with Daniel felt like a blur, each one slipping past her like the ebb and flow of a tide she couldn't control. Vivian's mind was no longer preoccupied with meetings, deadlines, or the polished facade of her business empire. Instead, she found herself thinking about the things she had ignored for years, the softness of a love that wasn't calculated, the quiet comfort of knowing someone who didn't need her success, but saw her, really saw her. She couldn't seem to shake the feeling that her life was pulling in two opposite directions, her high-powered world of fashion, wealth, and social circles, and the simpler, raw truth she was beginning to find with Daniel. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, his hands, working the fabric with precision, the way he spoke about his late wife, Sophie, like she had been the center of his world. And in her own heart, Vivian could feel the space that had once been filled with ambition slowly being overtaken by something else. It was Friday morning when she got the call from her assistant. "Vivian, we need to talk about the campaign with Ashton Designs. They've requested the final meeting before we launch. It's scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m. Let me know if you need any details ahead of time." Vivian's stomach churned as she looked at the message, but she knew she had no choice. The campaign with Ashton Designs was a massive deal, one that would elevate her company to unprecedented heights. It was the kind of project that could open doors to even bigger opportunities. It was everything she had worked for. But as she scrolled down her calendar, her eyes landed on a different note, the time she had agreed to spend with Daniel later that evening. She had told him she'd come back to see him, to continue talking about his craft and the life he had built. And now, as her mind raced between the two worlds, she found herself caught in the middle. She set the phone down, staring at the calendar with an ache in her chest. She had always known what came next. But for the first time, Vivian wasn't sure if what came next was the right thing. By 6 p.m., Vivian was standing at the door of her penthouse, holding her coat in one hand and her phone in the other. She had made a decision. The business world would always be there. She could go to the meeting in the morning. But Daniel, he had made her see that life was more than just the next big deal, more than just success. And though she wasn't sure where it would lead, she needed to see him. She needed to let herself feel. She texted him quickly, "I'm coming." The drive to Brooklyn was different this time. The roads, which once seemed like an obstacle, now felt like a journey. Her thoughts were no longer consumed by the upcoming campaign or the meetings she had to attend. She found herself wondering if Daniel's world, though simpler, was somehow more real. There was something about the way he spoke, about the quiet integrity he carried, that made her question everything she had built. She arrived at the market just as the evening light started to fade, casting long shadows on the stalls. The soft hum of distant conversation filled the air, and there he was, standing behind his booth as if nothing had changed. Daniel looked up when he saw her approach, his eyes softening the moment their gazes met. "Hey," he greeted her with a smile, but it was the kind of smile that seemed to hold so much more behind it. "Hey," Vivian responded, her voice lighter than she had expected. She walked closer, her heart thumping in her chest as she took in the familiar sight of the booth. The hats, now a part of her thoughts more than ever, seemed to tell a story all on their own. They weren't just products for sale. They were pieces of someone's life, each one carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. "I've been thinking about the campaign with Ashton Designs," Vivian started, her voice steady, but there was a vulnerability underneath that she couldn't hide. "It's a huge deal for my company. It's the kind of project that changes everything." She swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. "But I don't want to be that person anymore. The one who's always thinking about the next thing, the next deal, the next success." Daniel studied her, his expression unreadable at first. But slowly he placed the hat he had been working on down and leaned against the booth, crossing his arms. "You don't have to choose, Vivian," he said quietly. "You don't have to throw away everything you've built to find something real. But you do have to choose what matters most." Her chest tightened at his words. She knew he was right, but the reality of it hit her hard. "I've spent so much of my life chasing something I'm not even sure I want anymore," Vivian confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought if I had everything, money, status, power, it would fill the emptiness inside. But all I've done is build more walls around myself." "You don't have to tear it all down to start fresh," Daniel said gently. "But maybe you need to open up a little. Let yourself feel what you're afraid to feel." Vivian looked at him then, her heart pounding. The raw honesty in his voice, the way he said the words without hesitation, was exactly what she needed to hear. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she took a slow breath. "I've been running from the truth for so long," she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "Running from the love I'm scared to have, the life I'm scared to live, the kind of life that doesn't look perfect on the outside but feels real." Daniel's gaze softened as he took a step toward her, his eyes full of understanding. "You don't have to do it alone." Her breath hitched at his words, and before she knew it, she was stepping closer to him, caught in the gravity of everything she had been avoiding. She looked up at him, feeling a sense of vulnerability she had never allowed herself to feel before. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered. Daniel reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "No one ever is, but you'll never know until you try." And in that moment, with her hand in his, Vivian felt the walls she had spent years building around herself begin to crumble, piece by piece. The night after their conversation at the market, Vivian couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, all battling for attention. Her company, the campaign with Ashton Designs, the world she had created, and the world she was now daring to step into with Daniel. She sat by her window, the city lights outside blurring into a soft glow. The apartment was quiet, too quiet for comfort. She had everything she had ever wanted: power, success, the best of everything. But now, as she sat there in the stillness, she couldn't shake the sense that she was standing on the edge of something monumental, and the fear of falling held her back. She thought about Daniel, his simplicity, the way he lived his life with such authenticity and purpose. She envied it, though she was too proud to admit it. He had shown her a different way of being, one that wasn't defined by titles, wealth, or appearances. But could she truly walk away from the life she had built? Could she really abandon her ambition for the rawness of love? And yet she knew deep down that it wasn't an either-or decision. It wasn't about abandoning one for the other. It was about integrating both parts of herself, the part that craved success and the part that longed for real connection. But how could she reconcile them? How could she make it work? Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at it, surprised to see a message from her assistant. "Vivian, just a reminder about tomorrow's meeting with Ashton Designs. They're looking for final approval on the visuals. Please confirm if everything is on track." Vivian stared at the message for a long time, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. This meeting had the potential to change everything. The deal with Ashton Designs was a stepping stone to something even bigger, the kind of opportunity she had spent her whole life chasing. But at what cost? She let out a shaky breath, setting the phone down and closing her eyes. There was a pressure building inside her, a conflict she couldn't ignore. She had been living in a world where everything was planned, calculated, and controlled. Now the very foundation of that world was crumbling. Her mind turned back to Daniel. She could still feel the warmth of his hand in hers, the way his presence made everything feel simpler. "You don't have to do it alone," he had said. She wasn't sure if he meant in business or in love, but for the first time in years, she was allowing herself to consider the possibility of both. But tomorrow she had a decision to make. Would she continue down the path she had worked so hard to carve for herself, or would she risk it all for something real? The morning came too quickly. Vivian woke up with the weight of the world on her shoulders, feeling the pull of both sides, her career and her heart. She dressed in a sharp black suit, the familiar armor that shielded her from the vulnerability she had exposed to Daniel the night before. The drive to the meeting felt mechanical. The familiar streets of Manhattan, the sleek buildings, the high-end stores, everything felt like a performance now. She arrived at the office building, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floors. She was ready for this. She had always been ready for this. The conference room was exactly how she remembered it: sleek glass windows offering a view of the city, walls lined with abstract art that screamed wealth and success. The team from Ashton Designs was already there, chatting amongst themselves, as if everything in their world was perfect and preordained. Vivian took her seat at the head of the table, offering a tight but polite smile as she shook hands with the representatives. They started presenting their final designs, beautiful, polished, exactly what Vivian had asked for. And yet, as the conversation continued, Vivian felt a growing sense of detachment. The words felt hollow. The figures on the slides just numbers. No soul, no depth, no connection. It was then that the realization hit her hard. She wasn't just bored, she was disconnected. From the brand, from the project, from everything she had spent so long striving for. She had built this empire with her blood, sweat, and tears. But it wasn't enough anymore. The constant chase for perfection, the endless pursuit of wealth, it had left her empty. Vivian's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had spent so long convincing herself that this life was everything, that it would bring her the happiness she sought. But now, As she sat here surrounded by everything she had worked for, she realized that the only thing missing was meaning, and no amount of success could fill that void. The team continued their pitch, oblivious to her internal turmoil, and Vivian knew this wasn't the right path anymore. She opened her mouth before she could second-guess herself. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady, though the words felt like they came from a place of deep authenticity. "I think we need to reassess the direction of this campaign." The room fell silent, surprised by the abruptness of her statement. One of the designers, a tall man in his early 40s, looked at her with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Vivian, I'm afraid we're well into the final stages. Pulling out now could cost the company." "I know," she interrupted gently. "But I'm no longer convinced this is the right project for us. Not for me, at least." She stood up, her heart racing in her chest. "I think we need to pause and reevaluate. I'm sorry, but I'll need to take a step back from this. Let me know if you need anything further from my end, but I think you should take this in a different direction." The room was stunned into silence as Vivian grabbed her coat and walked toward the door. She couldn't look back, not now. She wasn't sure what this decision would mean for her career, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep living in a world that only valued success on the surface. As she left the building, the weight on her chest began to lift, replaced by something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. It was terrifying, but exhilarating at the same time. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a message from Daniel. "I'm here, whenever you're ready." She looked at the message for a long moment, a sense of calm washing over her. She didn't need the approval of the world anymore. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. For the first time in a long time, she was ready to just be. The afternoon sun dipped below the skyline as Vivian walked through the streets of Brooklyn, the weight of her decision slowly beginning to settle in her bones. She had left the meeting with Ashton Designs, a decision that felt both liberating and terrifying. She wasn't sure what came next. No one ever told her that the path to self-discovery would be so unclear. As she approached the market, the familiar smells of fresh bread and spices filled the air, grounding her in a way that the sterile conference rooms of her previous life never could. The buzzing energy of this place, real, gritty, and unpolished, felt like a stark contrast to the cold, calculated world she had spent so long trying to perfect. She spotted Daniel's booth from a distance. He was working on something, his hands moving with a practiced ease as he bent over a piece of fabric. When he looked up and saw her approaching, his face softened, a warmth in his eyes that felt like a beacon guiding her through the fog of uncertainty. She hadn't told him about her decision to step back from the campaign. She wasn't sure why it had felt so important to keep it to herself, but in that moment, she knew that her decision was about more than business. It was about her, about what she was willing to let go of, about what mattered to her most. "Hey," Daniel said with a gentle smile, his voice a mix of surprise and quiet warmth. "I didn't expect you so soon. Everything okay?" Vivian paused for a moment, taking in his calm presence. He was here, in this simple, unassuming place, living a life that was as real as it was hard. And here she was, standing on the precipice of change, wondering if she could ever step away from her past without losing herself. Vivian began, her throat tight with emotion. "I made a decision today." Daniel looked up, setting down his work to give her his full attention. "What kind of decision?" "I walked away from the campaign," Vivian said, the words slipping out almost before she could stop them. "I told them it wasn't right for me anymore. I told them to find someone else." Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, his gaze searching hers as though trying to understand. "Vivian, that's huge. I mean, I know that campaign was important to you, but are you sure?" Vivian took a deep breath, the reality of what she had done beginning to sink in. "I'm sure. I realized something today. I've been chasing success, thinking that if I just kept building, kept climbing, kept pushing, I'd be happy. But I was wrong. I didn't know what real happiness looked like. Not until I started seeing the world through your eyes, through the way you see your work, your craft." Daniel's expression softened, and he stepped closer to her. "And what do you see now?" Vivian glanced down at the ground for a moment, gathering her thoughts before she spoke again. "I see that I've been running from the things that matter. I've been afraid to let myself feel anything, to really connect with what's important, with you, with my own heart." The silence between them stretched, heavy and full of unspoken understanding. Daniel's presence, so calm and grounded, made her feel as though she were finally allowing herself to breathe again. For the first time in so long, Vivian felt the pull of her own vulnerability. "You don't have to be afraid," Daniel said softly. "You're not alone in this. You never have to do this alone." Vivian looked up at him, her heart in her throat. She hadn't expected his words to have such a profound effect on her, but there they were, wrapping around her like a lifeline. She had spent her life trying to do everything on her own, pushing people away because she was afraid they'd see the cracks in her armor. But Daniel wasn't asking her to be perfect. He wasn't asking her to be anything but herself, and that, more than anything, made her realize that she had been living a life built on illusion. She had convinced herself that power, success, and control were the keys to happiness, but in doing so, she had ignored the things that made her feel: love, connection, authenticity. Daniel had shown her that she didn't have to choose between the two worlds. She just had to figure out how to blend them together. Vivian stepped closer to him, the distance between them shrinking as she allowed herself to close the gap. "I'm scared, Daniel. I don't know if I'm ready to leave everything behind. My company, the life I've built." "You don't have to leave everything behind," Daniel said gently, reaching out to touch her hand. "You just have to stop running from who you are. You've been building a life that others expect from you, but you need to start building the life that feels true to you." Vivian swallowed hard, his words cutting through the layers of fear and uncertainty that had held her back for so long. She had always lived her life on other people's terms, pushing herself to meet expectations that were never truly her own. But with Daniel, she realized that she could build something of her own, something rooted in love, authenticity, and emotional truth. For the first time, she didn't feel like she had to choose between ambition and love. She could have both. She could create a life that was her own, one where she wasn't afraid to let her heart lead the way. "I want to try," Vivian said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to try to build a life that's real, one where I don't have to hide behind the walls I've built, and I want to do it with you." Daniel's eyes softened, and he stepped forward, closing the space between them. He took her hand in his, holding it firmly as though telling her without words that he was there, that they were in this together. "You don't have to figure it all out today," he said softly. "You don't have to have all the answers, but I'll be here. I'll always be here." Vivian felt the weight in her chest ease as she looked up at him, the reality of what she had just said sinking in. She had chosen to step out of the life that had confined her and into something unknown. But with Daniel, she felt as though she was finally coming home. Together they stood there, surrounded by the chaos of the market, but in that moment, it was just the two of them. Two people, figuring out what came next, one step at a time. The next few days felt like a slow unfolding of new realities. Vivian had made the decision to step away from her old life. Not completely, but enough to open space for something that felt more real, more true. The weight of that decision, while freeing, also left her with a lingering uncertainty. She hadn't yet told her closest friends, her family, or her colleagues. The fear of judgment still gripped her, but with Daniel, she didn't feel that fear as acutely. With him, she was learning to breathe again, learning to embrace the messy, unpolished parts of life that she had spent years trying to ignore. Daniel, too, was a quiet constant in her life now. They saw each other nearly every evening after work, and their conversations moved easily between the mundane and the profound. They shared stories about their childhoods, about love and loss, about the moments that had shaped them. But it was never rushed. With Daniel, there was no expectation of a perfect narrative, just an unfolding, a sharing of bits and pieces of themselves that seemed to fit together perfectly, like two halves of a whole. Yet, as she allowed herself to grow closer to him, the distance between her two worlds, her life in the city, her life with Daniel, began to stretch wider. She couldn't ignore the stark differences between their lives. His humble stall in the market, his slow, purposeful days filled with craft and care, and her own high-rise apartment in Manhattan, where meetings and emails filled her every waking hour. It wasn't just the difference in wealth. It was the difference in the very nature of their lives. Daniel had built something with his own hands, something real and honest. She had built something that, on the surface, appeared perfect, but left her feeling hollow. She was beginning to question her own place in this world, questioning if she truly wanted to return to the high-powered career that had defined her for so long. The following Thursday, Vivienne stood in front of her closet, her fingers grazing the delicate fabrics that hung neatly on the racks. The sleek, sharp lines of her suits, the luxurious materials she had grown so accustomed to, now felt like armor. Armor she wasn't sure she needed anymore. She wasn't sure if she could go back to that life. Her phone buzzed on the vanity next to her. It was a message from Lillian. "I need to talk to you. Are you free for lunch tomorrow? We need to catch up." Vivienne hesitated before typing a response. She and Lillian had been friends for years, but their relationship had always been a little transactional. Lillian was her confidant in business, the one who helped her navigate the complexities of the fashion world, but they rarely talked about personal things. Lillian had always admired Vivienne's drive, her ability to make hard decisions with confidence, and perhaps she wouldn't understand what Vivienne was going through now. Still, Vivienne could feel the pull of the conversation waiting to happen. She couldn't run away from her own life forever. So, after a long pause, she typed back, "Sure, let's meet at 1 p.m. at the Waverly. I'll see you then." The next day, Vivienne walked into the upscale restaurant, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. She spotted Lillian immediately, sitting at a corner table with a glass of wine in front of her, a look of anticipation on her face. Lillian was dressed impeccably as always, her sharp suit giving off an air of controlled power, the kind of woman who never let anything show on the surface. Vivienne hesitated before joining her, the weight of the conversation ahead making her nervous in a way she hadn't expected. This wasn't going to be just a catch-up. Lillian would want answers, would want to know why Vivienne was suddenly making decisions that didn't align with the ambitious woman she had always been. "Hey," Vivienne said, sliding into the seat across from Lillian. Lillian smiled but raised an eyebrow, her expression cool but curious. "Hey, so what's going on? You've been a little distant lately. Are you okay?" Vivienne took a deep breath, her gaze drifting to the menu in front of her before she set it aside. She couldn't focus on anything else right now. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," she started slowly. "About what I want. About what's been driving me all this time. And I've realized I've been living my life in a way that isn't true to who I am anymore. I don't want to keep running after things that don't make me feel alive. Lillian frowned, clearly confused. What are you saying? You're not talking about your business, are you? Vivian nodded, feeling the tightness in her chest grow. I am. I can't keep doing this anymore, Lillian. I've been chasing the next big deal, the next promotion, the next win, and it's left me empty. I've been so focused on building my career, but I've neglected the things that really matter. Lillian's gaze sharpened, and she leaned forward, her tone suddenly more serious. So what? You're throwing it all away? You're just going to give up on everything you've worked for? Vivian's heart thudded heavily in her chest. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment she had to confront the reality of her choices. No, I'm not throwing it all away, but I'm stepping back. I'm not sure what that means yet, but I can't keep pushing forward with something that doesn't feel authentic to me anymore. And I don't know if you'll understand, but it's not just about business anymore. It's about everything. Lillian stared at her for a moment, her face unreadable. Vivian could see the wheels turning in her friend's mind, the questions and doubts taking root. You've always been so driven, Viv, Lillian finally said, her voice softening. You've built something incredible. But I don't want you to give up on it just because of some temporary dissatisfaction. You're good at this. You have a vision. Don't throw it away for some romantic ideal about authenticity or meaning. That's all well and good, but it's not going to pay the bills. Vivian felt a pang of frustration, something she had been anticipating but hadn't quite prepared for. I'm not throwing it away, but I'm also not going to keep living a life that only fills the bank account and not my heart. I don't want to wake up one day and realize I've missed everything that matters. Lillian took a long sip of her wine, looking over the rim of the glass as if contemplating her next words. So, is this about Daniel? Vivian's heart skipped. She hadn't expected the question, but it was clear that Lillian had put the pieces together. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the table. Yes, but it's more than just him. It's about the kind of life I want to live. And I'm not sure it's the one I've been living. Lillian studied her for a long moment, the silence between them stretching until Vivian felt like she was suffocating under the weight of her decision. Then you have to be sure, Lillian said quietly, because the choices you're making now, they're going to change everything. You can't go back. Vivian looked at her friend, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I know. And I'm not going back. I'm moving forward, with or without the business. Lillian exhaled slowly, finally nodding. Then I guess I'll support you, Viv. But you'd better be ready for the consequences. Vivian's chest felt lighter now, as though a weight had been lifted. Lillian's approval didn't come easily, but she could see the sincerity in her eyes. This was her decision to make, and she was finally ready to embrace it. Consequences and all. The week after lunch with Lillian felt like a series of small, deliberate steps, each one leading Vivian further into uncharted territory. The decision she had made was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had told Lillian the truth. She was stepping away from the business, at least for now. But the weight of it still lingered, pressing down on her every time she passed her office or glanced at the contracts stacked on her desk. Vivian found herself at a crossroads, unsure of what to do with the space she had created in her life. There were moments when the world she had once so passionately crafted seemed so far away, and there were other times when the fear of leaving it behind crept up on her like a shadow. But as the days passed, she grew more certain of one thing. She couldn't go back to being the woman she once was. That woman was lost in a cycle of ambition and self-imposed isolation. The woman she was becoming had the possibility of something more, a life that was both meaningful and real. She hadn't seen Daniel in 2 days. After their last conversation, where she had bared her heart to him, She found herself wrestling with a new kind of fear. She had stepped away from the campaign, yes, but now there was a new level of vulnerability she wasn't sure how to navigate. The connection between them was undeniable, but she was unsure of what he expected from her or where this path would lead. Daniel was everything she had wanted, yet everything she hadn't allowed herself to need. He was steady, grounded, and full of heart, a man who gave without expecting anything in return. And Vivian, she was still learning how to accept that. She wasn't sure if she was ready for a relationship, not after everything she had left behind. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up, half expecting it to be Lillian with more questions, or her assistant with updates about the business. But when she saw the name on the screen, Daniel, her heart skipped a beat. "Can we meet at the market later? I've been thinking about what you said. I want to talk more." The message was simple, but it carried weight. Vivian swallowed hard as she typed a reply. "I'll be there in an hour." By the time Vivian arrived at the market, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the cobblestone streets. The market was quieter than usual, with only a handful of people milling about, but the energy still felt alive. It always did. She spotted Daniel immediately. He was standing behind his booth, his hands working on a new hat, his focus absolute. When he saw her approaching, he paused, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't say anything at first, as if waiting for her to say what was on her mind. Vivian stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. The simplicity of his booth, the humble materials, the quiet nature of his work, made her feel like an intruder in a world that was so far removed from her own. She was still trying to make sense of everything. How could she move from the high-powered world of luxury fashion into something so different? "Hi," she said softly, feeling the need to break the silence. "Hi," Daniel replied, his voice calm but with a hint of curiosity. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night, about wanting to change things, and I think I understand." Vivian's heart tightened. "I don't know if I understand it myself, Daniel. I don't know if I'm ready to leave it all behind." Daniel set down the hat he was working on and took a step closer to her. "You don't have to leave it all behind, Vivian. You just have to decide what's important to you, and then you make room for it." Vivian blinked, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had spent so much of her life moving toward success, ticking off boxes on a checklist she had created for herself. But somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of what it was all for. Now, in this moment, standing in front of Daniel, she realized that she had no idea what truly mattered to her anymore. She didn't know if she could ever be happy in the world she had left behind. "Do you ever wonder if you made the right choice?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every day," Daniel said without hesitation, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I've learned that it's not about right or wrong. It's about what you can live with. It's about choosing the things that make you feel alive." Vivian nodded slowly, feeling a pang of longing deep in her chest. It was so simple, so clear when he said it. Yet for her, it felt impossible to untangle the web of expectations that had been placed on her life. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, the vulnerability in her voice raw and unguarded. "You don't have to do it alone," Daniel replied, stepping even closer. He gently took her hand in his touch warm and reassuring. "I'm here, Vivian. I've been here waiting for you to figure this out. But don't be afraid of what's next. You don't need all the answers right now. You just need to be honest with yourself." Vivian looked down at their hands, his rough fingers against her soft skin, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a quiet peace wash over her. She had spent so long trying to control everything, to make sense of every step, every decision. But Daniel wasn't asking her to have it all figured out. He was asking her to feel, to allow herself to be uncertain, to live in the present instead of the future. "You're right," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been afraid of what comes next. But I think I'm ready to stop running." Daniel's expression softened, a smile spreading across his face. "That's all I wanted to hear. You don't have to have it all figured out today, Vivian. Just take the next step, and I'll be here." Vivian closed her eyes, the weight of everything she had been carrying slowly lifting as she let herself relax into the moment. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time she didn't need to know. With Daniel by her side, she was learning how to embrace the unknown, to find beauty in the uncertainty. And in that moment, standing together in the warmth of the setting sun, Vivian knew she was finally on the right path, one that was hers, and hers alone. The following days were quieter for Vivian, and strangely, that was both comforting and unsettling. She had stepped away from her old life, but it wasn't easy to simply let go of everything she had spent so long building. Every time she passed her sleek, minimalist apartment or glanced at her phone with its endless emails, the weight of the choice she had made lingered. But when she was with Daniel, everything seemed different. He had become a steady anchor in her life, the one person who never asked her to be anything other than herself. When they were together, there was no pressure, no pretense. Just two people, learning to navigate the messy and beautiful parts of their lives together. Still, the reality of her decision to step away from her company had yet to fully sink in. She hadn't shared the news with anyone else yet, least of all her family. Vivian knew her father would disapprove, perhaps even cut her off. He had always wanted her to be the perfect image of success, the woman who dominated the business world and climbed the social ladder with ease. The thought of disappointing him filled her with a gnawing sense of guilt. But she had made a choice that felt right, even if it was terrifying. And then there was Lillian. She had been supportive, but Vivian sensed a quiet hesitation in her friend's words. It was hard to explain to someone who had never known a life beyond ambition that she was ready to step away from it all. Lillian's world, like her own, had been built on achievement, and it was hard for people like them to understand that there was more to life than what could be quantified. That afternoon, Vivian decided to visit Daniel's market again, needing the space to think and breathe away from her world of endless expectations. As she approached the market, the familiar hum of voices and the earthy smells of fresh produce and handmade crafts filled her senses. The world here felt different, alive in a way that was impossible to capture in a boardroom. She spotted Daniel at his booth, talking with a customer. His dark eyes were focused on the conversation, but when he saw her approaching, his face softened, the familiar smile appearing on his lips. "I didn't think you'd come by today," Daniel said, his voice warm and welcoming as she reached his booth. He had a way of making her feel like she was the only person in the world when he spoke to her, and today that feeling felt even more necessary. "I needed to get out of my head," Vivian confessed, her gaze wandering over the rows of hats, each one a testament to Daniel's care and craftsmanship. The simplicity of it all felt grounding. "I've been thinking a lot." Daniel raised an eyebrow, sensing the weight in her voice. "About what?" "About everything," Vivian said, her voice quieter now, as though the words themselves were heavy. "About the choice I made, about my business, about what comes next." Daniel's expression softened, and he gestured for her to sit on the wooden crate beside his booth. "What's weighing on you?" Vivian sat down, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the crate. "I stepped away from the campaign. I told Lillian, and now I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing. I mean, I've always been so driven. but now I don't know where to go. The fear of making the wrong choice is overwhelming." Daniel leaned against the booth, studying her. "It's okay to be scared. You've spent so much time building something that it's hard to imagine stepping away from it. But you know, Vivian, the thing about fear is that it often tells you what's most important to you. It's the part of us that tries to protect what we love. But sometimes you have to let go of something, even if it scares you, to make room for what really matters." Vivian's chest tightened at his words. She knew he was right, but the idea of letting go of the life she had worked so hard to build was a battle she wasn't sure she was ready to face. What if, in letting go of everything, she lost herself? What if she wasn't strong enough to live without the validation that came with her success? "I'm not sure if I'm strong enough to leave it all behind," she said softly. "I've worked so hard for so many years. What if I'm making a mistake?" Daniel's eyes softened with understanding. "It's not about leaving everything behind, Vivian. It's about choosing what you want to keep. You don't have to give up everything, just the parts of your life that don't serve you anymore. It's about finding balance, not in doing less, but in doing what truly matters." Vivian looked at him, the calm in his voice soothing her unease. "But how do you know what matters? How do you know if you're making the right choice?" Daniel smiled, a small, almost sad smile. "You don't. Life doesn't give you guarantees, but you learn to trust yourself. Trust the decisions you make. The right path will always make itself known." Vivian felt a lump form in her throat at the tenderness in his voice. He wasn't offering her solutions. He was offering her something far more valuable, the permission to be uncertain, to be human. For so long, she had relied on the cold certainty of numbers and goals. But here, in this small, humble market stall, Daniel was showing her that sometimes the most important thing was to allow yourself to be vulnerable. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her emotions settle into her chest, and looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in what felt like weeks. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm scared that I'll lose myself in all of this, that I'll regret stepping away from everything I've worked for." Daniel reached out, his hand covering hers gently. "You're not going to lose yourself, Vivian. You're just finding a new version of yourself, and that's okay. It's not about perfection. It's about being." Vivian closed her eyes, taking in his words, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a peace she hadn't known she was looking for. The fear still lingered, but it wasn't as loud, and it wasn't as consuming. She realized that it wasn't about choosing between her business and her heart. It was about integrating both parts of herself. She could still be ambitious. She could still be successful. But she didn't have to lose who she was in the process. When she opened her eyes, she found Daniel watching her with a quiet intensity, as if he were giving her space to figure it out, without pressure or expectation. "I don't know what comes next," Vivian said, her voice steady. "But I'm ready to find out." Daniel smiled, his thumb brushing over her hand, a silent reassurance. "You're not alone in this, Vivian. You never have been." Vivian looked at him, the weight of her past decisions slowly lifting. Maybe she didn't have all the answers yet, but with Daniel by her side, she felt like she could face whatever came next. Vivian awoke the following morning with a lingering sense of clarity, as though the fog that had clouded her thoughts for so long had finally begun to lift. It was a strange feeling, liberating and unsettling all at once. For the first time in years, she didn't feel tethered to the weight of her ambition or the constant pressure to succeed. Instead, she felt an odd stillness, as if the world had paused, waiting for her to take the next step. She had told Daniel that she was ready to find out what came next, but the truth was, she wasn't sure what that meant. The decision she had made to step away from her company and the career she had worked so hard to build was both freeing and terrifying. It wasn't just the fear of losing everything that made her hesitate. It was the fear of losing herself in the process, of never truly knowing who she was beyond the title, the brand, the life she had created. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at it and saw a message from Lillian. "Vivienne, we need to talk. Call me when you get a chance." The words sent a knot of anxiety straight to her stomach. The last time they had spoken, Vivienne had told Lillian about stepping away from the campaign, but Lillian hadn't fully understood. She had been supportive, but there was a coldness in her voice, an undercurrent of concern that hadn't gone unnoticed. Now, Vivienne couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that might force her to confront her choices head-on. With a deep breath, Vivienne picked up the phone and dialed Lillian's number. It rang twice before her friend picked up. "Vivienne?" Lillian's voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it. "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I need you to understand something." Vivienne felt a tightness in her chest. "What do you mean?" Lillian paused, as though gathering her thoughts. "I know you think stepping away from everything is the right choice, but you're putting a lot on the line. You've worked your whole life to get where you are? You've built something, and you're just going to walk away from it?" Vivienne closed her eyes, leaning against the windowsill. "Lillian, I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't want to live for the next deal, the next victory. I don't want to keep sacrificing myself for something that doesn't fulfill me." Lillian's voice softened, but the concern was still there. "But what about your legacy? What about everything you've built? I'm just worried that you'll regret this decision. You can't just throw it all away without considering what it means. You've worked too hard." Vivienne hesitated, feeling the pull of Lillian's words. She understood her concern, but for the first time, Vivienne was beginning to understand something else, that her legacy didn't have to be defined by her career alone. She could create a life that was meaningful on her terms. It wasn't about throwing everything away. It was about making space for what mattered most to her. "I don't want to throw it all away, Lillian," Vivienne said softly. "I just don't want to keep chasing something that isn't mine to begin with. I want to live for the things that matter: love, connection, authenticity. I want to build something that I can look back on and feel proud of, but for different reasons. Not because of power or success, but because it's real." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Vivienne could almost hear Lillian processing her words. Finally, she spoke. "I understand, Vivienne. I do. But you have to understand that this is a huge change. It's not just about stepping away from the campaign. It's about everything. You're taking a risk. You're going to have to confront the people who've relied on you and the expectations you've built. It's not going to be easy. It might even cost you." Vivienne swallowed hard. "I know. And I'm willing to pay the price." Lillian's voice softened further, a hint of acceptance in it now. "Just promise me you'll be sure that you've thought this through. And if you decide to walk away, know that I'm still here for you. But this is a bigger decision than you're giving yourself credit for." "I promise, Lillian. I've thought about it for a long time, and I'm ready." The call ended with a heavy silence, and Vivienne set the phone down on the counter, feeling the weight of her decision settle in. Lillian had always been her rock, the voice of reason when Vivienne had been lost in the grind of her ambition. But now, she was walking a different path, a path that would require her to trust herself more than she ever had before. Later that evening, Vivienne met Daniel at the market again. She needed to see him, needed the peace that he brought to her life. She found him as usual, working behind his booth, the soft, golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow on his features. He looked up when he saw her, and a small smile crossed his face. "Hey," Vivian said, her voice a little shaky as she approached him. "Hey," Daniel replied, his eyes softening as he took in her expression. "How are you doing?" Vivian sighed, sinking into the crate beside him. "I talked to Lillian today. She's not sure about what I'm doing. She thinks I'm making a mistake. But I can't keep living a life that's not mine. I don't know if I can go back to the way things were, Daniel." Daniel set down the piece of fabric he was working with and turned his full attention to her. "You don't have to go back. You don't have to keep doing what everyone else expects. You've made your choice, Vivian, and I'm proud of you. I know it's hard, but I can see it in you. You're doing the right thing." Vivian looked at him, feeling a flood of emotions rise within her. "I don't know if it's the right thing, Daniel. I don't know if I'm ready to face everyone who will question me, my father, my colleagues, everyone who's invested in the version of me that's built on success." Daniel gently reached out, taking her hand in his. "You're not doing this for anyone else, Vivian. You're doing it for yourself. And that's all that matters. You've already made the hardest decision, the one that was hardest to make. The rest will fall into place." Vivian closed her eyes, feeling the truth of his words seep into her soul. For the first time, she didn't feel like she had to apologize for wanting something different. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She was allowed to choose her own path, and with Daniel by her side, she didn't have to face it alone. The decision was made. Vivian had chosen the path less traveled, the one that led away from the life she had so meticulously crafted. But the weight of that choice still lingered in the back of her mind, especially as the world around her continued to move at its usual pace. Her company, her colleagues, her family, they all seemed to expect her to return to the fold, to pick up where she had left off, to continue climbing the ladder of success. But Vivienne was no longer sure if that ladder was worth climbing. She had spent a lifetime pursuing external validation, trying to earn approval from a world that only valued her for what she could achieve, for what she could give. The beauty of what she had built was now tinged with regret, because she had sacrificed so much to get there. So much of herself, her time, her heart. And now, sitting in the quiet of her apartment, she could feel the soft ache of realizing that none of it had been worth the price. Not anymore. The only thing that seemed to matter now was Daniel. Daniel. She had always known that their connection was different. There was something about the way he moved through the world, steadfast, grounded, that made her question everything she had ever believed about herself and the life she had been living. He was the opposite of everything she had known, unconcerned with wealth, unburdened by status, and yet somehow richer in spirit than any of the most powerful people she had ever met. And now, as she stared out the window of her high-rise apartment, the soft hum of the city below her seemed so far away, like an echo of a life she was no longer part of. But even as she embraced this new direction, the reality of what she was giving up still weighed on her. She wasn't just leaving behind a career. She was stepping away from the identity she had built for herself. She was letting go of the power, the validation, and the security that came with it. And as much as she yearned for the peace that Daniel had shown her, the fear of what she might lose kept gnawing at her. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Lillian. "I need to talk to you. Can we meet for dinner tonight? I'm worried about you." Vivian felt a lump form in her throat. She knew this was coming. Lillian's concern had been simmering ever since their last conversation, and now it was clear that her friend wasn't going to let this go. Vivian had made her choice, but Lillian was still tethered to the world Vivian had walked away from. After a long pause, Vivian typed back, "Sure, I'll meet you at 7 p.m. The usual place?" Yes, of course, I'll be there. The restaurant was busy when Vivian arrived, the ambient noise of clinking glasses and hushed conversations filling the space. It was a place she had frequented countless times, the kind of upscale establishment where the food was exceptional and the atmosphere was always just a little too perfect. Lillian was already seated when Vivian arrived, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Vivian slid into the chair across from her, offering a small, uncertain smile. Lillian's gaze flickered to her, but it was clear she wasn't here for pleasantries. "I've been thinking about you a lot," Lillian started, her voice a little sharper than usual. "And I'm honestly concerned, Viv. You've walked away from everything. Your company, your career, your reputation. You can't just abandon it all without thinking about the consequences." Vivian sighed, her chest tight. She had known this conversation was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. "I didn't just abandon it, Lillian. I stepped away. I had to. I was living a life that wasn't mine. I wasn't happy, and I couldn't keep pretending I was." Lillian's eyes narrowed. "You're telling me you're willing to throw away everything for some fleeting feeling? You've worked your whole life for this, Vivian. You built something incredible. And now, because of some romantic ideal, you're going to walk away from it?" Vivian's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't back down. "It's not about some fleeting feeling, Lillian. It's about who I am, who I want to be. I can't keep living in a world where I only matter for what I can achieve. I need to matter for who I am. And Daniel, he's shown me that there's more to life than just ambition. It's about living in the present, about connecting with people, about loving without conditions. I've been running away from that for years, and I can't keep doing it anymore." Lillian took a deep breath, her fingers tapping against the glass of her wine. "But what happens when the dust settles? What happens when you're not in the middle of this emotional whirlwind? What will you do when you're back in the real world, without the high-rise, without the business, without everything you've spent so long building?" Vivian opened her mouth to respond, but the truth was, she didn't know. The uncertainty of it all threatened to swallow her whole. But in that moment, she realized that she didn't have to know. She didn't need the answers right now. What mattered was that she had made the decision to be true to herself. "I don't know, Lillian, but I do know this. I can't go back to living the way I was. I can't pretend that everything I've built is enough when it's left me feeling empty. I have to try something different." Lillian's expression softened, but there was still a trace of worry in her eyes. "I just want you to be sure, Viv. This isn't just about you anymore. There are people who are relying on you." Vivian nodded, her voice firm. "I know, and I'm not abandoning them. I'm just choosing a different path, one that feels right for me. I'm sorry if you don't understand, but this is the only way I can live with myself." There was a long pause between them, the silence thick with the weight of Vivian's words. Lillian leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful but still tinged with concern. "I don't know if I'll ever fully understand, Viv, but I'll support you. I always have." Vivian's heart fluttered, and she reached across the table, placing her hand over Lillian's. "Thank you. I need you to know that I'm not throwing it all away. I'm just finding a new way to be." Lillian smiled, albeit weakly. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Vivian. I really do." Later that night, after dinner with Lillian, Vivian found herself standing in the quiet of her apartment, staring at the skyline outside her window. The weight of her decision still hung heavy, but it was no longer suffocating. She had chosen a new direction, and though the path ahead was uncertain, she was ready to walk it. And when she closed her eyes, she could feel Daniel's presence beside her, steady and unyielding. He wasn't asking her to be perfect. He was simply offering her the space to be herself, to find her way back to what truly mattered. Vivienne knew that she was on the edge of something beautiful, even if she couldn't yet see the full picture. For the first time in a long time, she was living for herself, and that was enough. The weeks that followed felt like a delicate reawakening. Vivienne had spent so many years locked in the pursuit of success, trying to prove her worth to the world, trying to outrun the emptiness that whispered beneath the surface of every achievement. But now, standing at the edge of a life she was slowly learning to build for herself, she felt a new kind of freedom, a freedom she had never known before. She had told Lillian the truth. She had stepped away from the world of corporate suits and boardrooms, from the endless chase of the next big deal. But more than that, she had made a choice to be her, not the woman who was defined by her accomplishments, not the woman who could only measure her worth in terms of wealth and status, but the woman who could finally embrace vulnerability, love, and the possibility of something more. And Daniel, in his quiet strength, had been there with her every step of the way, showing her what it meant to live authentically. In his presence, Vivienne had learned that love didn't have to be a commodity, and that real connection wasn't measured in the size of a paycheck or the prestige of a title. It was in the simple things. The way he held her hand when she felt uncertain. The way he listened without judgment. The way he allowed her to be imperfect. That Vivienne understood what it meant to truly live. But even with all of that, she knew there was still one final decision to be made. One that would test her commitment to the life she was building. Vivienne had spent the past few days walking through the streets of the city, her thoughts swirling around her decision. Her father had called, his voice filled with disappointment when she told him about stepping away from her business. He couldn't understand why she would leave behind everything she had worked so hard to build. To him, success was everything. Without it, you were nothing. The calls from her colleagues had become fewer, more distant, and she could feel the weight of their silence. She was no longer part of their world, and though she had been prepared for that, the absence stung more than she had expected. Yet, with all of that, Vivienne had never felt more alive. She was choosing herself for the first time in years, and she knew she had made the right decision. But there was still a nagging question that lingered in the back of her mind. Could she truly reconcile the two parts of herself? The woman who had lived in the world of wealth and power, and the woman who now yearned for a simpler, more genuine life with Daniel? Could she merge the ambition that had defined her with the authenticity that Daniel had shown her? Or would one side of her inevitably dominate the other? The answer, Vivienne realized, wasn't about choosing one or the other. It was about integrating both parts of herself, the woman who had built an empire and the woman who now understood the value of stepping back and embracing what really mattered. She didn't have to abandon her ambition, but she could redefine it. She could create a life that was both powerful and authentic, driven by love and purpose rather than mere success. She thought about Daniel as she walked to the market that evening. He had shown her a life that wasn't just about wealth or appearances. It was about the depth of connection, the strength of love, and the importance of staying true to oneself no matter the cost. When she reached the market, she found him exactly where she expected him to be, standing behind his booth, working on a new piece. The sight of him, so focused and so completely at peace in the simplicity of his world, filled Vivienne with a quiet certainty. She didn't need to choose between her old life and her new one. She could have both. And in doing so, she could finally live a life that was truly hers. As he looked up and saw her, Daniel's face broke into a smile, and he stepped toward her, his hands wiping off the fabric he had been working on. "You look like you've made up your mind," he said softly, his voice warm with understanding. Vivienne nodded, her heart swelling as she walked toward him. She took his hands in hers, feeling the familiar comfort of his touch. "I have. I've made peace with it, Daniel. With everything." I don't have to choose between who I was and who I want to be. I can be both. Daniel's eyes softened, and he gently cupped her face in his hands. You're right. You've always been enough. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Vivian's chest tightened as she realized how much she had needed to hear those words. For so long, she had measured her worth by the approval of others, by what they thought of her success. But now, with Daniel's steady gaze, she knew she didn't need anyone's approval but her own. I want to build something with you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I want to create a life that's true to both of us. I want to be a part of this world you've built, the one where love and authenticity are the only things that matter. And I want to bring my ambition into it, but in a way that feels right. Daniel smiled, pulling her closer. Then let's build it together. You don't have to leave anything behind. We'll find a way to make both worlds fit, one that honors who you were and who you're becoming. Vivian closed her eyes, resting her head against his chest, letting the warmth of his embrace soothe her. For the first time in years, she felt complete, not because of her achievements, but because she had allowed herself to be vulnerable, to open her heart to someone else. They stood there for a long moment, the world around them fading into the background. Vivian knew that there would be challenges ahead, that integrating both parts of her life would take time. But with Daniel by her side, she no longer felt afraid. Together, they could create something that was truly their own, a life built on love, authenticity, and the strength to be exactly who they were.